Hello, this is Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia, The Well, a podcast series about topics of interest to Ukrainians around the world. Today is Thursday, March 13th, 2025. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Our guest today is Bohdan Nahaylo, a British-Ukrainian journalist and writer and chief editor at the Kyiv Post in Kyiv, Ukraine. Welcome, Bohdan. How are you?
Very pleased to be on your podcast today.
And thank you so much for joining us. To start off with, can you tell us a bit about your professional background?
Yes, I was born in Britain, educated in Britain, studied at the universities of Leeds, Manitoba, the London School of Economics and Political Science. Um, my PhD topic was the Shelest period in Ukraine, a period of national reassertiveness in the 60s, hence an interest in the 60s, Шестидесятники, and the dissidents, etc. I had the good fortune of meeting some top class, not only scholars, but um, influential British people that were interested in dissidents and human rights in the former Soviet Union, Peter Redaway being my professor at the time. And through him, I established contacts with Amnesty International. And in 1978 to 82, I was head of the Soviet desk at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. From 1980, I was a writer for the British press, the let's say the top publications at that time, the Times, the Guardian, etc. But I was also a columnist, a regular, almost on a weekly basis, contributor to The Spectator, Britain's most I suppose, oldest and one of the most respected publications, and occasionally for New Statesman, where Chris Hitchens, the late Chris Hitchens, was a good friend. And also, he, in fact, published my first article in that type of publication in 1980. In 1984, I was invited to join Radio Liberty. I worked for many years as a senior research analyst, writing on Soviet affairs, as they were called, specializing in nationalities problems and dissent and Ukraine. And in 1989, I became director of the Ukrainian service until independence was achieved in Ukraine in 1991. Then I went back to research, was deputy director of the Research Institute of Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe in Munich. By that time, my book Soviet Disunion had come out. It went into 5 editions, including a Japanese one. As a result of that, in 1994, I got a surprise phone call from the headquarters of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Geneva, Sadako Ogata, Japanese. She'd read my book in Japanese, Soviet Disunion, and invited me to join her team as a senior policy advisor on the CIS countries. I stayed with the UN for 21 years. I was representative of UNHCR in countries such as Angola for 4 years, Azerbaijan 2 years, Belarus 3 years, took part in missions to Russia during the war in Chechnya, etc. But after that, I retired in 2013, but in 2014, I was called back to head the Department of Political Affairs in Kyiv, just as Crimea had been seized by the Russians and they had essentially invaded eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. That lasted for a while. Then I worked for several NGOs, returned back to journalism, and for the last 3 and a bit years, I've been the chief editor of the Kyiv Post.
Well done. Do you think Ukraine is ready to hold elections?
No, not at all. This is not the time for elections. The mood in Kyiv is not one where elections are sought. This is the last thing on people's minds. I mean, this is a fabricated issue, fabricated both in Washington, but also amongst some of the political opponents of Zelensky, and especially in Moscow. They want regime change. They don't want to deal in Moscow with such a defiant president and war leader, hence the onus on changing the team in Kyiv. Um, and from the point of view of Ukrainians, there are millions of Ukrainians outside the country as refugees. 20% of the country is occupied. There are security issues. There are financial issues in organizing an election in such conditions, etc., etc. And to be frank, being in Kyiv, I don't see anybody emerging as a viable alternative to Zelensky at this particular moment.
What is the situation like now for media in Ukraine? Do you think the cutoff of U.S. foreign aid through USAID to selected groups such as Ukrainer will have a major impact on media?
I don't think it will have a major impact. Obviously, it will interfere with the training of young journalists and with the raising of journalistic standards through coaching and training and exposure to Western standards. But I think the problems with media were more serious a few years ago when the full-scale invasion occurred, when Kyiv, the official Kyiv, cracked down on the pro-Russian elements in the media and also suggested that there be one marathon ongoing program giving the news and giving the take, shall we say, though it in effect became the take of the president's office on the war and on Ukraine's place in the international scene. I think that was more of a challenge than the cutting of USAID aid.
And on the economic front, is the rare earth minerals agreement that's proposed by the U.S. a good deal for Ukraine? And does it come with any implicit security guarantees for the country?
No, I've said publicly in many of my statements for other media, international media, Polish, British, Canadian, and others, that the Trump administration is effectively bullying Ukraine and acting as a protection racketeer. We give you protection from bandits, Putin, but we want this in return without any security guarantees. And that, I think, was the big stumbling block. And this led to the, unfortunate meeting in the White House where Zelensky had to face a very aggressive Trump entourage, determined, as it were, to humiliate um, the Ukrainian leader and, as it were, put him in his place. But for Ukrainians in Kyiv and for their allies in Europe, Washington's behavior, or rather the Trump's administration's behavior, smacks of 19th century colonialism. It really is not the type of behavior that a friend and ally would be expected to show in such circumstances. And it sends a very bad signal not only to Ukraine, but also to NATO partners, to Europe generally. I mean, think of how many countries have been helping Ukraine very strongly and have increased their support. Not one of them has been demanding payment in return, payment in kind, as it were, but access to the mineral wealth, the economy of Ukraine in such a brazen way.
What is the likelihood that a 30-day ceasefire agreement will take place between Ukraine and Russia? There have been some rather negative statements coming out of Moscow about this today.
I don't think that there's much of a chance that that will happen unless there is some kind of miracle and indeed Trump has outwitted us all, which I doubt, and it will be very, very serious in the demands he makes, or rather the threats he makes to Russia, particularly as far as increasing sanctions, hitting on oil prices that will affect Russia's economy, etc., and agreeing, perhaps saying that Ukraine should be allowed access on a fast track to the EU, but that the NATO membership now will become inevitable if Russia continues to be so intransigent.
Do you think Europe can fully support Ukraine with foreign aid if the U.S. does not maintain its share?
I don't think that it would be the kind of support, the level of support that Ukraine's been used to. I mean, financially and maybe in terms of arms in the near term, in the immediate future, because Europe's not prepared itself. It's just getting its act together and will be developing its defense sector, but it's not there in place, as it were. And of course, Europe is also a fragile creature. There are, different tendencies within it, and it's very difficult to foresee if that unity of the coalition of the willing, as it's being called, will hold, because Europe has its own immense economic problems internally, challenges from immigration issues, etc. But I think that for the longer term, if Ukraine can hold out, European support in some sort of reconfigured version, let's say a parallel um, security architecture parallel to NATO, that could make a big difference. We're talking about France, Britain, and Germany under its new chancellor, and Poland, say, offering the leadership. But look how effective, or rather active, even Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, Finland, have become. So, as I said, Europe is getting its act together, but it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. Ukraine has to hold on, and that's why Zelensky and his team, on behalf of Ukraine, have been so desperate to maintain at least a level of American support that can see Ukraine through this very tricky, challenging patch in the immediate future.
Bohdan, unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but I do have a final question. What have been your major challenges since November 2021 as chief editor at the Kyiv Post?
Well, there were problems at the Kiev Post before because there was a mutiny on board by some of the younger people who didn't want to follow the owner's vision of expanding Kiev Post into having a Ukrainian desk, which it now has, an Arabic desk, which it had, but we closed it during the Gaza crisis because we just didn't have the resources to maintain it. But since then, the immediate challenge was to transform what had been a newspaper, in effect, given out to expats in Kiev for free in hotels and restaurants into a very serious global influencer, a real voice of Ukraine, which meant not only improving the quality of the reporting and broadening it to make it much more international and not so introspective, focusing on corruption in the country as it largely did until 2021, and also building social media, and what that has meant is that we now have about 4 to 5 million viewers each month, as opposed to a solid core of about 10,000 uh, newspapers handed out and some thousands of viewers online. Now some days we have a million people looking at us on social media, but on average, as I say, about 4 to 5 million. And we are taken seriously. We are regarded as the reliable voice, objective voice of modern Ukraine. And therefore, I should add that only 3% of our readers are in Ukraine, and over 50%, about 57%, are in the United States, then Canada, Europe, Germany, Holland, Australia, even India now. So that has been a huge challenge to re-equip, retool, find the right people, train the staff, and to learn the ways of the modern world now with AI on the scene and other things. So if you want a revolution in many ways, plus the security challenges of the war, the initial cyber attacks on our site, very frequent in the first months, families of journalists, who are under constant bombardment, and the mothers or the fathers come to work and have to work in those conditions when they're worried about their loved ones. So, it's been very challenging, but at the same time, we have a great team, and I think we've risen to that challenge.
Bohdan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
I have been speaking with Bohdan Nahaylo, a British-Ukrainian journalist and writer, and chief editor at the Kyiv Post in Kyiv, Ukraine. And I'm Mike Burek, your host and producer of Krynytsia the Well, a podcast series on topics for Ukrainians around the world. This episode is produced for The Ukrainian Weekly, a newspaper published in English for the global Ukrainian community since 1933. Until next time, that's all for now.